Okay, guys, we're going to be talking about the echinoderms, so that's sea stars and their relatives today. So some examples of echinoderms would be starfish or sea stars, as we like to call them, because technically they're not fish. Sea lilies or feather stars, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and sand dollars. These are all in the same phylum. They're all considered echinoderms. Now, echinoderm means spiny skin. So all of them have these, you know, these like spikes on their skin. Some of them, like in the sea stars, are often very tiny, whereas in the sea urchins, like you see here below, the spikes can be quite long. All right, so again, there's 5 different groups that we're going to be talking about. So, sea stars, you've all familiar with those. Um, sea lilies or feather stars. Here we have some sea urchins. A sea cucumber. You can see the tube feet along the sea cucumber here. And of course, you guys have seen these washed up on the beach before. Now, the echinoderm body plan is in some ways similar to what we've seen with the cnidarians, and that is they have no anterior or posterior ends. There's no head end or anus end. There's no dorsal or ventral, so there's no backside or stomach side, and that is because the echinoderms, like the cnidarians, have a different type of symmetry. They don't have bilateral symmetry like you and I, but instead they have radial symmetry, right? So the mouth is actually located here, and everything is sort of arranged around the mouth, very much like what we see with the cnidarians. So instead of calling it the anterior or the posterior and all that stuff, which doesn't make any sense because they don't have any heads, we call it the oral surface and the aboral surface. So the oral surface obviously is the surface that has the mouth, and the aboral surface would be the back or the surface that does not have the mouth. So again, they have radial symmetry. Now, what's interesting about this is we think that it's a secondary characteristic, which is to say that at one point they had bilateral symmetry and that they evolved this radial symmetry. And why do we think this? Well, because if you look at the larvae, they actually are bilaterally symmetrical. So if you see this larvae over here, you can kind of cut it down the middle, and one side would be the same as the other side. Now, we haven't talked a whole lot about this, but the sea stars are deuterostomes, and that means the blastopore becomes the anus. So in that sense, they are more similar to us than they are to the other invertebrates like worms and snails and things like that. So again, it's thought that they are the most closely related invertebrates to humans. So when we think of echinoderms, we often think of the number 5, right? So think of like a sea star. A sea star usually, but not always, has 5 arms. Now, all the echinoderms do have spiny skin. They all do have an internal skeleton. So this is the first time we've ever seen an internal skeleton. And they have, again, that 5-part body plan, that things are found in 5s. And they also have what's called the water vascular system. So we'll be talking more about that. But the water vascular system is something sort of new and different that no other group of animals has. And associated with the water vascular system are these 2 feet. So again, all echinoderms have have these spines. They could be very short spines like we see here, or very long spines like we see here. But they all have this spiny skin. They all have an internal skeleton. So this internal skeleton are made of these bony plates that are bumpy or spiny. Now, it's called an internal skeleton, and simply because there's like a layer of skin over it, but it's still kind of on the outside. but it is definitely underneath the skin. And you would see that if we were to do the sea star dissection, which we normally would do. Now, this water vascular system, what is it? It is a system of tubes that carries food and oxygen and removes waste. So we have our blood and blood vessels and heart that does that same job. In the case of the echinoderms, they don't have a heart, they don't have blood, or blood vessels for that matter, no veins or arteries or anything like that. Instead, they have this series of tubes that runs throughout their body, and it's filled with seawater. And the seawater kind of acts like a blood in the sense that it's able to carry around the necessary things that the sea star needs, like food and oxygen. The water vascular system, as we'll see in just a little bit, also helps the echinoderm to move. So it provides this kind of suctioning pressure or something like that that actually helps the tube feet to move and helps the tube feet to grip onto things. So here's the water vascular system. So again, we see the 5-part body plan, and it's found inside the sea star. And it's just a series of what looks like tubes made out of bone. And you don't have to know the parts of the water vascular system, but just know that you have the kind of the central ring. You have this thing that actually pulls in the seawater when it's necessary. And again, you have these tubes going down the arms of the sea star, and then you see these things, many of these things on each side, which look like turkey basters. And these are the tube feet along with the sucker and the ampulla. And basically, it acts like a turkey baster in the sense that when this thing contracts, this thing at the end, when this contracts, it provides suction. And the sea star will use this to grip onto things. Again, you don't have to know all the parts of the sea star, but you should know that we have this 5-part body plan, and that each arm has has all of the parts. So each arm is going to have some digestive gland in it. Each arm is going to have some nerve cords in it. Each arm is going to have some water vascular system in it. Each arm is going to have some reproductive glands in it. So the thing with sea stars and their relatives is that because they're so simple, they can reproduce asexually. Or if you were to cut them up into little pieces, in theory, each arm could grow into a new sea star. So one of the things that fishermen don't typically like sea stars because they eat mussels and clams and other things that they'd rather sell to people. So they would chop them up and they'd throw them back in the water. Well, the problem with that is they thought they were getting rid of the sea stars, but in fact they were actually helping them to reproduce. And so one of the things, of course, they can do is they can regenerate. So if a sea star were to lose an arm for some reason, it could regrow a new arm, no problem. So these tube feet you see here in this picture, is actually a pretty good picture here. You can see it's that they have 2 rows of these tube feet, and they can actually act like feet. The animal will often have hundreds of these, and they can act like little feet or legs, and they can enable the sea star or whatever it is to kind of walk along the bottom of the ocean. These tube feet, as I mentioned, also act as suction cups, so when they can grab food, or the sea star can actually grab onto a clam or a mussel, and it can actually pull it apart using these hundreds of tube feet so it can get at the meat that's inside. So they're used for getting around or movement, and in the case of the sea stars, definitely used for getting food. Now, of course, there's many types of echinoderms, and they feed on different things. But some of the ways that they feed, we already mentioned that the sea stars use their tube feet to pull apart bivalves, so things like clams, oysters, and things like that. The sea cucumbers will actually push through the sand. These guys are more like worms. So these sea cucumbers are more like worms in the sense that they sort of burrow through the sand on the bottom of the ocean, and they will ingest or they'll take in the sand, and they will feed on the organic matter that's in the sand, and then sort of poop out the sand at the back. Many of the echinoderms have jaws that are again found in these sort of 5-part pattern. And so things like sea urchins will use these jaws to scrape algae off rocks or to eat seaweed and that sort of thing. Again, these guys have no blood. They have no circulatory system or heart. Instead, all of the oxygen and CO2 and waste is handled by the water vascular system. As far as excretion goes, getting rid of nitrogenous waste, this also happens through the tube feet. So just like how we are able to sweat out some of our nitrogenous waste, they're able to do the same through their tube feet. And of course, they have an anus through which their undigested food or feces will exit. As far as response goes, they do not have a highly developed nervous system. So as we saw with the Cnidarians, they do have nerves, but they don't have a brain. So there's no like central, nervous system, so to speak. And that makes sense because, the way their body is set up, they are not, they don't have a head end and a tail end. So their nervous systems are pretty simple. They do have some nerves, but they're sort of, scattered throughout the body. And they have lots of cells, again, scattered throughout the body that can detect light and chemicals or give them a sense of smell or detect gravity. So they can a sea star can move towards food or move away from something that's bad. It can detect that stuff, but again, it doesn't really have like a really highly complex brain. As already mentioned, they'll use muscular contractions or their tube feet or some combination thereof to kind of move around. If you watch a sea star moving, it just kind of glides along the bottom of the sea using these hundreds of tube feet as like little tiny legs to walk across the bottom. As far as reproduction goes, like many of the animals we've seen so far, they have external fertilization with male and female gonads found in the same animal. So oftentimes what happens is they, at a specific time of day and of the year, they'll all release their eggs and sperm into the ocean at the same time and hope that they meet. And as already mentioned, when the egg and sperm meet and the egg is fertilized, they will produce a bilaterally symmetrical larva. So let's talk about the different groups really quickly. So the sea stars or starfish is one that you're probably most familiar with. And of course, they have 5 or more arms. So again, the arms always come in multiples of 5. So some sea stars have 10 arms or 15 arms or 25 arms. But again, always in this pattern of 5. And they have hundreds of these tube feet on the bottom of the oral side of the sea star that act like suction cups. Now, if you look here in this picture, we have a sea star, and if you had to guess what these were called, you might be right, because if you look at these, they look almost like chocolate chips, and so these are called a chocolate chip sea stars. So we did mention that they're able to regrow their arms. So here's a sea star here, which lost an arm due to injury. And you can see that it's starting to regrow new ones. So, not unusual in sea stars. With humans, we can't do that, obviously. Here is a great picture of a sea star, which is holding onto a mussel. And you can see these tube feet that are latched onto it using this powerful suctioning force. And what the sea star is doing is it's pulling on the 2 shells, and it's slowly opening the bivalve so it can insert its stomach in there and feed on the contents. So again, 2 feet, very important, not just for movement, but for obtaining food, and especially in the sea star, where it uses these very powerful 2 feet to pull open these bivalves. If you ever try to open a clam or an oyster with a screwdriver or a knife, it's very difficult. They have very strong muscles, and you're more apt to break the shell than actually physically force it open. Sea urchins, which I'm sure you've seen those before, these have they're known for their very long spines, and obviously these are used for protection. In some cases, some species of sea urchins actually have poisonous spines, so you probably shouldn't grab one if you see it, just in case. Now, sea urchins actually have a mouth on the oral side, and they actually have these 5 teeth-like structures that are used to scrape away at algae. Sea urchins also can be they can move, quite well. They can do this by either using their spines as sort of legs to walk along the ocean floor, or like the sea star, it will use its 2 feet. So the 2 feet aren't as obvious, but they have 5 rows of 2 feet in between the spines here. And we'll use these to kind of grab onto the ocean floor and kind of sort of roll along the ocean floor. So here we see, this is a common sea urchin found around here called the green sea urchin. It's got these shorter greenish spines, and you can see this is the mouth, and this is obviously the oral side. And you can see it's got these 5 sort of teeth-like structures, and we'll use these to, again, to eat, to scrape algae off rocks or to eat, seaweed. Sand dollars, of course, you've all seen this type of sand dollar in the store, but really what you're looking at here is you're looking at just the skeleton that's left over. Now, sand dollars, you don't see that 5-part symmetry as obviously, but even in the top here, you see it's got that 5-part, it almost looks like a little baby sea star on top here. Now, sand dollars do have very short spines. You can just barely see them here in this picture. This is a living sand dollar. So this is a dead one. This is a living one. And what they do is they actually move along the ocean floor using their 2 feet, and they'll eat algae or other detritus. Detritus meaning like just dead stuff on the bottom of the ocean. Brittle stars. So brittle stars are in their own group, but they look very much like sea stars, except they have these long sort of serpent or snake-like arms. I had one of these in my saltwater tank a few years back, and they're pretty cool. They can use their arms to kind of walk across the ocean floor, almost like you might imagine like a robot or an alien, and so they can move actually pretty quickly for an echinoderm. Again, they eat a detritus, just dead stuff on the bottom of the ocean. Maybe a fish dies and falls down to the bottom, or there's some rotting algae or seaweed on the bottom of the ocean. They would happily eat that. Like sea stars, if they lose an arm, it's not the end of the world. They can grow it back. So in the case of brittle stars, brittle meaning they break easily, these arms can actually break off to help them escape predators. So think of like a lizard, for example, where it might be grabbed by a predator, and the tail can break off, and the lizard can get away, and it can regrow that. The brittle stars can do something similar. The sea cucumbers, sometimes referred to as sea pickles, they have sort of this longer, more worm-like body shape. And again, they have rows of 2 feet that allow them to walk across the ocean floor. They also can kind of move like a worm in this, they will contract their muscles and move more like a worm. And again, like many of these echinoderms, they eat detritus. So anything that's just dead and laying at the bottom of the ocean. In many cases, they'll simply eat the mud or the sand found at the bottom of the ocean, and they will, like a worm, like an earthworm, they will eat any dead material that's in there, and then just excrete the mud or sand out the back end. So in that sense, they're kind of like the earthworms of the ocean. And the fifth and last group that we're going to talk about are sea lilies or feather stars. These look quite a bit different than sea stars, but if you were to count the arms, they still have that 5-part symmetry. So they often have more than 5 arms, but they are in 5s. And you can kind of think of these as being sort of like a sea star with long feathery arms, which is upside down and attached with a stalk to the seafloor. And it's thought that these are the oldest of all the echinoderms. We have, fossils going back, millions and millions of years. Some of the first animals were actually looked like these feather stars. And they're often seen on coral reefs where they use this, stalk-like structure to attach to the coral reef, and their arms are extended up, and they use these sort of feathery arms to filter feed or capture small particles of food as it floats by.